Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me today. I thought I would answer your questions. These questions are from Discord, the Quick Pod Questions channel, I think it's called. Alex, who is a frequent contributor to those questions, who always has great questions, says, is family systems or any systems theory only limited to family therapy, or can it also be used in individual therapy? If so, how? End of question. Yeah, absolutely. It's been used, systems theory has been used in all forms of therapy since the inception and the introduction of the theory into therapy, I don't know, in the 60s-ish times. But it lends itself to family therapy, perhaps more easily or seemingly more readily. But honestly, systems theory is massively helpful in individual therapy, particularly when people are talking about their relationships, right? You know, if it's a very frequent thing that clients will come in to talk about their marriage or their relationship with their parents or their kids. And if you understand systems theory, it's a lens to look at the client through that can really help. For example, if someone's complaining, you know, say a husband is complaining about his wife, and if I think more linearly, I might try to figure out who's to blame, so to speak. And although a lot of therapists will claim that they don't really do this, it is something that all therapists really have to do. Because, you know, if a husband comes in and says, yeah, my wife, you know, she didn't clean the dishes, so I pushed her down the stairs. Like, every therapist would say, well, that's not, you know, your wife isn't to blame. You're 100% to blame for that, and you need to stop doing that, right? So, and that's an exaggerated example, but micro examples or sort of less exaggerated examples is, you know, so I came home from work the other day and I was in a bad mood, and my wife was, I don't know, she was trying to cheer me up, and I was grumpy, and then she started to cry, and I told her that she's crying too much lately, and so I didn't know what to do, so I just went to bed. And most therapists, if not all, will hear that story and try to figure out the landscape, you know, who's being fair, who's being triggered, whose issues are being, triggered, whose issues are at play in this situation. And the way I described it, it sounded like it was more on him. She, the wife, is sensitive, but her tears and hurt seemed rational at the time. So it's a thing that we always do, and it's a worthy, evaluation or assessment aspect. But if you have systems theory, it helps you to have a helpful conceptualization of that. That, for example, this is the way I apply systems theory. Not everyone does, but, and you know, to some extent, it's intuitive. Well, let me back up and say what a linear thinker would do. And most therapists, I hope, well, I don't know, some therapists would be this way. But if you just presented this story to the lay public, they might hear it and quickly. And I notice this effect when I'm watching reality TV, as people will almost always side with one or the other. And so you could see a group of people siding with the wife, maybe if you can identify with the wife more and say, oh my God, you're a jerk face, you know, saying to the husband as he tells this story, because he's grumpy and I don't like that. Or you might identify with the husband and say, oh yeah, I know, when I come home from work, sometimes I just want people to leave me alone, and I don't understand why you have to be so sensitive all the time, like everything is my fault. And, you know, you'll see that. And I actually will do this in my classes, is I'll show a clip or something, and I'll ask the students to free write about their countertransference, and I will ask, okay, who sided with this person? And raise your hand. Okay, who sided with this person? And I find it's incredibly important for everyone to, because when you're having a reaction, it feels like the right reaction, But when you see a room of other therapists all having different reactions, you go, oh, my reaction is just my reaction. It's not the reaction. It's not the right reaction. It's just how I see it. It's a bias. It's a take, that I have to recognize that. But a systemic thinker will look at the couple and say, well, who's to blame? Both, neither, who cares? The more helpful conceptualization or understanding comes from how this pattern perpetuates itself, how each person contributes based on the knowledge and information before them with, they're each trying in these little micro decisions to create a situation where everyone's getting their needs met, but it's flying off the rails. Like an example from nature is you are you're in the 1940s United States in Wyoming, and I always bring up this example because it just really illuminates a lot of things about humans. And you notice there are a lot of wolves, and the wolves are getting into the campsites, and there might have been a scary wolf attack of some sort, or wolves were eating the cattle or something like that. So you're like, oh, this is bothersome. There's a problem. Wolves are a problem. Okay, so you try to find a solution. And what do? Okay, well, our goal is to have the best life in Wyoming. Our goal is to make sure we can make money from livestock. Our goal is to make sure that people are safe. Okay, well, so let's kill all the wolves. And there was a whole program that they paid hunters to by the head of the wolf, so that a lot of the wolves died. And then fast forward a few years, or I don't know how long it took, but long story short, the entire ecology just fell apart because there were too many deer. The deer were eating too much of the foliage, which caused the dirt to become more loose, which caused the rivers to become more polluted with runoff, which caused the fish to die, which caused the bears to die, which caused, and all because they weren't thinking systemically, they were thinking linearly. And so when we look at a couple, if you just go with the linear perspective and just tell the husband that he needs to not be grumpy, knock it off, or tell the wife you're being too sensitive, then you run the risk of destroying the ecology because you don't really understand how the system is working. So when you understand these and you zoom out, then you can say, okay, well, how are they mutually triggering each other at the same time, such that they each are, reacting to the trigger that triggers the other person? You know what I mean? It's like, I'm triggered by you, and so I try to respond to that trigger in this way, which triggers you, which causes you to respond in a certain way, and I see that behavior and it triggers me, and then I have a reaction to that trigger, and it's all happening at the same time. It doesn't really matter who's to blame. We just know it's a pattern, and we have to intervene on the systemic level. Now, in individual therapy, you're asking, well, how do you intervene with a system in individual therapy? And what I do is I essentially teach the individual systems theory. I don't necessarily use this language, but I will use the language of mutual triggering and possibly of even mutual predictive identification, because if they understand that, then they can go home and see the bigger picture themselves and change their part and see their partner's part in a way that isn't linear and more systemic. You know what I mean? So yeah. And we teach courses in our program about how to use systems theory with individuals. Absolutely. All right. Another person on Discord, Artist Wolf, asks, can you discuss the psychology behind getting irritated with people for being sick? I don't know if everyone does this, but sometimes I just feel kind of annoyed at someone for catching a cold or something, even though my mind knows that's irrational and honestly pretty unkind. End of question. Yeah, I've seen this before. I don't think it's incredibly common, but the explanation that I will often explore is one's past regarding other people being sick, or even your own sicknesses. You could imagine if you were sick as a child and rejected, then one way to cope with that is to adopt a schema that it's annoying when people get sick, because that's what you're seeing. You get sick and people seemingly get annoyed with you or reject you. Or when you're young, other people are being sick and utilizing it as a way of getting more attention, or getting some sort of special treatment that is overblown, and thus you have a resentment around that. I think that's also possible. But there's a lot of other possibilities, like when some people are sick, they're really vulnerable and they have a lot of needs. And so not when you were young would you be rejected when you were sick, but you might have been rejected when you just had needs. And I've seen this before. People have emailed in around this phenomenon that, they went through a lot of neglect or abuse growing up, and when they see good relationships on TV or in movies between parents and children, they actually get angry. And that makes sense. So that would be the avenue that I would go down. There's also a possibility, given today's landscape, that when other people are sick, and I can kind of relate to this, I don't know if I want to say this out loud, but when people around me get sick, I'm mostly neutral and compassionate and understand how rough it is to be sick, particularly in today's landscape. Because, if you get a non SARS-CoV-2 virus and you start getting sick, there's always this worry, like, do I have COVID? Am I going to have long COVID? What's going to happen? Is this going to escalate to, am I going to be hospitalized? Even if you take a test and it's negative, there's still like this possibility it was a false negative. So, there's a lot of anxiety about that. But I will say that when people get sick now around me, and it's happening more and more as things are opening up, there is a small part of me that feels like they should have been more careful. And that's irrational as well, because if, for example, you have little kids, there's only so much you can do. Also, there's a tiny part of me, not a big part, that will get a little annoyed that I am now impacted by the fact that they're sick, because I don't want to get sick, and I have to maybe draw some boundaries between me and them, because I don't want to get sick. I've always been this way, even before the pandemic. I don't like being sick. It is a mood killer for me. And if you've ever had that sickness where you're up all night coughing, it just ruins your life. You can't sleep, and it wasn't that long ago. I remember having Stacy and I both had this coughing virus maybe a few years ago, and the cough was just awful. Your stomach starts to hurt. You feel like your eyes are going to pop out of your head because you're coughing so much. And so yeah, there's a little bit of that. But like I said, I think mostly I just care and worry about them. All right, the next question from Discord is from Chlorify, who says, I'd be interested in additional content in projective identification, especially in a relationship context. I am a dependent avoidant person with a borderline ADHD overfunctioner. What behavior should I own, and which ones belong to my partner? Can you talk more about that? Yeah. Well, briefly, and this relates to what I was talking about earlier in terms of systems theory, because I integrate systems with attachment and psychodynamic object relations, projective identification kind of stuff, because to me it all is in the same ballpark, but for some people it's not. Anyway, so with projective identification, in a nutshell, we internalize relationships early in life and all the associations with that relationship, and then later on, if we are still struggling with that internalization, we will project one side onto other people while identifying with the other side. So if you had a critical father and you felt criticized, you'll internalize that whole relationship as a dyad. And then later in life, you might project the criticizer onto other people, meaning you'll see criticizing when it doesn't actually happen, or you'll pick to marry someone who is prone to critical behavior, and you'll identify with the internalized self of the worthless criticized. Or you might alternatively, or sometimes even at the same moment, project the criticizable, ridiculous person onto your partner while identifying with your father, who is the criticizer. Okay, that's in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it, obviously, but that's in a nutshell. So with dependent avoidant, I don't know, but typically what that refers to is someone that believes that there's something deeply wrong with them, and they can't do things unless someone helps them. And they feel helpless when they're alone. They feel incompetent, and they're very afraid of doing things without a lot of guidance, because they just assume they're going to screw it up, and they might sabotage themselves often because to agree with their inner belief about themselves, and they'll avoid learning things, and they don't get a chance to learn things because they're very rarely, if ever, doing things on their own. So you could be 35 as a dependent avoidant and have the skill set of like a 13-year-old because you've just never tried to do things on your own. So that's it in a nutshell with dependent person. With the borderline ADHD overfunctioner, the borderline bit isn't necessarily connected to ADHD, which isn't necessarily connected to the overfunctioner. So there's a few different things here. With the borderline individual, they internalize a relationship of abandonment and or betrayal, and they felt betrayed or abandoned. With ADHD, it's hard to know exactly how that affects them, but the overfunctioner part is the role of always feeling responsible. Codependent personality disorder, I did a whole deep dive on that not too long ago, and my conceptualization of codependency is early in life you were made to feel as if you had to be in contact with someone else's problems and trying to fix them in order to feel safe and worthy as a human being. So for codependent, for overfunctioners, they might find someone who is dependent avoidant, for example, because the dependent avoidant person believes they can't do anything on their own, and the overfunctioner codependent person believes they can't, they're not safe unless they're telling someone else what to do and fixing someone else's problem. So, maybe it was a role they had in their family or whatever. So the predictive identification, the borderline, so let's focus on your partner with the borderline and with the overfunctioning. You're dependent avoidant, which avoidant, not attachment, I don't think is what Glorify is referring to, but avoidant personality disorder, right? So, which is, in a nutshell, you could consider it extreme, almost delusional social anxiety. So let me think about this. How would these interact? So the dependent avoidant person will have likely a dyad inside of them of an internalized other that says you can't do things on your own, you're incompetent, something like that, and a self that believes that they are incompetent. So the dependent avoidant person is quite prone to projecting the codependent that they internalized when they were young, and the criticizer, there's probably like criticism in there too, and bulldozing, enmeshment, this kind of thing. And so the dependent avoidant person will be attracted to someone that is overfunctioning and codependent. Borderline doesn't really have a lot to do with that necessarily. I mean, you could see how it would be intertwined a little bit, but it's not I don't really see that very often where borderlines are more likely to become codependent and overfunctioning. So the dependent avoidant person is had likely as a child been in a relationship with someone that was codependent with them and enmeshed with them and bulldozing them and not letting them do things on their own. giving a heavy vibe that the child is not ready to move on to the next developmental step, and so they internalize that, and then they project it on. They find someone that does that. An overfunctioner is a perfect person to fall in love with and to project that onto the other person. But really, it's an internal issue that they're trying to work out. And the reason why we use predictive identification in my model is threefold. One is it's comfortable, because that's what we know, and love means that to the individual, so they just are attracted to it. Two is they're trying to actually work it out. They're trying to have it go differently this time, and they're trying to engineer a corrective experience. Now, often, and this is all subconscious, often it actually isn't therapeutic. It isn't a corrective experience, and actually just compounds the internalization and makes it more likely that you'll use predictive identification in this way in the future. And the third reason, I don't have my notes in front of me. So it's comfortable. We're trying to work it out, and it's hard to have an internal representation that is only internal. For example, when a dependent avoidant person isn't with an overfunctioner, and they're just by themselves, and there isn't someone enmeshing with them, they are likely to suffer even more, because the voices are from within. The voice of criticism, the voice of you're worthless, is actually noticeable from the inside. But if we find someone who is going to yell at us and bulldoze us, it's coming from the outside, and thus we'll be distracted from our own internal voice. It's easier to deal with someone that's yelling at us than to have ourselves yelling at us. And it's not ideal, obviously, but because at the very least you can look at that person and say, you're ridiculous, you're a bulldozing, overreactive, controlling, micromanaging person. You can sort of blame them and get angry at them, but how do you get angry at an internalization? How do you distance yourself from you? So that's another reason why we'll use predictive identification in my model. And then at the very same time, for the borderline overfunctioner, they both have internalizations regarding abandonment, betrayal, and with they're worthless unless they're helping someone else. And so they either likely overfunctioners, codependent people, not always, were in charge of their parents. Often they're parentified, and so it's a real weird mixture of internalizations. So let me talk about that for a second. So with codependent, the internalizations are you're generally worthless unless you're solving someone else's problems. Your only worth is when you're helping someone and micromanaging them. And if the other person doesn't have a problem and or their problem gets out of control, then you're really worthless. So actually, I don't know if I've ever said it like that before, but I think that's how I think of it. Because with codependence, there's a real sweet spot in terms of the other person's problems. If the other person were to have no problems, then the codependent person would fall apart, because that's their duty. That's where all their worth is to help someone with their problems. But if the person with the problems has a big problem, a very noticeable problem, then they're also worthless because they're screwing it up. And so they're looking for this sweet spot of definite problems in their partner, while trying to minimize, trying to mitigate the problems, trying to get the problems down below a certain threshold, but not so low of a threshold such that the individual no longer has problems that they can actually focus on, because then they have to just, again, live on the inside of their mind, which is chaotic and difficult to deal with. It's much easier to get rid of one side of the dyad and work on and just identify with one side, if that makes sense. Anyway, so with borderline, I don't know, but depending on the level of awareness and insight and recovery that your partner has, the borderline partner might also be frequently triggered around abandonment and project onto you, glorify the abandoner, abuser, betrayer. And so for you, you maybe weren't doing anything along those lines, or barely, and it plays into, might be a lot of criticism, might be a lot of emotional attacking of you. And since deep down you believe you're a piece of crap and worthless, then it all kind of plays into that, right? So you could see how that configuration would really fit well together and compound each other's, internalizations, destructive internalizations, or introjects is what they're sometimes called. But you can obviously go to therapy with someone that understands all this and engineer corrective experiences such that each of you can have a different experience. With predictive identification in therapy or otherwise, when we're trying to engineer a corrective experience, we're trying to resist the urge to fall back into the old pattern and create an experience that counteracts. So for you, the dependent avoidant person, what would help you is if someone, your partner, let you do things on your own, even if you make a mistake, without them having to micromanage you or freaking out if you make a mistake. Because how else are you supposed to learn? And through those interactions, someone treating you like you're a grown adult who is special and competent, and you'll learn, you'll figure it out. Then you have a different experience and a different internalization, and one that's more positive and more helpful to meeting your needs. And that action will also diminish the original, internalization of you are incompetent and ridiculous. For your partner, what they're hoping for with borderline is to have an experience where they're not abandoned and not betrayed, and also secure and loved and paid attention to, and not exploited. So and you can provide that to them. Again, therapy can help engineer that. And given your configuration, it'd be hard to engineer a corrective experience without some guidance. But I don't know. I don't know the degree of the issues or your insight. For the codependent person, what their corrective experience is typically is that they need to experience allowing other people to make mistakes and do things and even have a negative consequence, and learn that even though they weren't constantly micromanaging, the world didn't fall apart, and they're still a lovable, worthy human being. And that's really hard for codependents to do. It is so hard, because you have to tell them to take their hands off the wheel and just close their eyes while they're driving a car, essentially, and just trust that it'll be okay. Or if something bad happens, it won't be that bad. Or if it is kind of bad, that's important. For you, the dependent avoidant person, there's a chance, if you're significantly dependent, that you've literally done nothing on your own ever. And, I always think about how, like for me, I was not raised to be dependent. If anything, I was raised to be too independent. And I just think about all the stupid mistakes I made from the age of 10 to 22, or more importantly, maybe like 13 to 22. And some of the mistakes were pretty disastrous, but, I got through it. And that's the age, there's an age appropriateness to freedom and without micromanaging, without helicoptering, that will produce some chaos and some negative consequences. Like one thing that happened to me was when I first started driving, actually before I started driving, I was with a friend who was a couple years older, and she got a ticket. We were in California, actually, and she got a ticket. And from my understanding of how it worked out, I could have just been perceiving it wrong, was that the court called you. So which probably isn't true, but somehow that's what I thought how it worked, So she gets a traffic violation ticket, and I'm there in the car when the cop pulled us over. And in my memory, she went home. She didn't do anything with the ticket. She just waited for the courts to call, which again just sounds stupid, but that's what I thought. So when I got a ticket a couple years later, when I got my license, I actually got pulled over for speeding, and I also got a ticket for having headphones on because I was listening to my Walkman, because the car I was driving, it probably didn't have a cassette player, so I had my headphones on, and I was driving without my shoes because I hate wearing shoes. I've always hated the confinement of shoes, and I got a ticket for not having my shoes on, which I always thought was just one of the stupidest rules. Like, what's wrong with driving? I drive better without my shoes on. I can feel the accelerator better, So I just never understood that. It's like, I think some people say, well, you need to have a firm surface. Your foot might slip off. And I think that's ridiculous. The other point that people say, well, if your shoe like rolls behind the accelerator or the brake, like that could be disastrous. And yeah, well, I know how to, prohibit that from happening. just the whole idea of that. And, so anyway, I got that ticket and I just went home. I didn't tell my parents about it. My parents didn't micromanage, so they didn't ask or check in with that. And fast forward a number of months, and my parents get this letter in the mail saying that my license has been revoked, and thus I no longer am insured on their auto insurance, their driving insurance. And they come to me and they're like, so not only did they find out that I got a ticket and didn't tell them, and I didn't pay it, so it like tripled in price. It went from like $40 to $200 or something. That's not triple, that's quintuple. I don't know. I remember it was a lot of money because I didn't pay it, because it says on the ticket you have to pay it through this thing, or you check the box if you want to contest it. And I think I literally just threw the ticket away because I just figured, well, they were going to call me. So not only did they learn I got a ticket, I didn't tell them, but then they learned that my license was revoked because I didn't pay it. And it was like a lot more expensive now because I didn't pay it. And I was kicked off of the car insurance and had been driving with a revoked license for a number of months because I didn't know, because they never reached out to me about it, because I was waiting by the phone for the government to call when I was supposed to take the action. Of course, the police officer probably told me that when he gave me the ticket, but I was in such a state of like, oh my God, I just got a ticket. I didn't listen to him, So my parents were livid, and we had to go to court, I remember, and tell them the situation. I had to go with my parents, and it was really humiliating, and my parents were, really, really upset at me, and I had to pay them back the money that they spent for it. And that's it's a really stupid, negative consequence mistake that I made at that age, but I made it at the age of 16 is the thing. If you're dependent avoidant, then, and an underfunctioner, you've been denied the opportunity to make those mistakes and learn. And the amount of lessons one learns when they go through something like that are tremendous. Tiny little lessons that you learn, like watch for police officers. Don't wear headphones while you're driving. I knew that was against the law, but I don't know. I was just at an age where I just didn't think I would get caught, or you learn, and you intellectually know that when you get a ticket, you have to pay it. But when I actually had to work hard to pay my parents back every hour that I worked, I was reminded of how horrible getting a traffic ticket is. It was no longer an intellectual thing to me. It was a visceral thing that was heartbreaking to work for 8 hours and then just hand all that money over to my parents because I made this stupid mistake by getting a ticket and not paying it. Another lesson learned is pay attention to the police officer when they're giving you instructions about anything, like the ticket. I learned that I probably should tell my parents earlier than later, because that was another factor. I should have owned up to it. They could have helped me. They've been like, well, where's the ticket? Because we got to deal with it. I'd be like, what? I thought they were just going to call me. I should have said something. I should have just bit the bullet and said something. I learned about court systems and about insurance and about how the system works, because when you're young, you just figure like someone will tell you, because that's usually what happens, right? And I just figured, well, someone will tell me what to do and I can just go on with my life. And I learned that that's not the case in the real world. My parents would do that for me because they would notice something, like if we were about to go on a road trip or something, the day before, my parents would notice I hadn't packed, and they might say, hey, you got to pack. It's that kind of childish mindset that you have when you're young that you just take for granted. And often for us humans, we have to have that notion disabused by a slap in the face, figuratively. And I had that, and I learned, when it comes to the government, they don't hold your hand. You got to figure this crap out on your own. And horrible consequences will happen and they don't care, because I went to them, I said, I didn't know. They're like, well, the police officer told you, so that's on you. So welcome to the real world. And, there's so many little lessons. There's so many. Another lesson I learned is when a cop pulls me over, as they had a number of times in the intervening years after that, particularly when I was young, is I got to put my shoes on as soon as I pull over. I pull over, slip my shoes on, and I won't get a ticket, because they can't see if I'm slipping my shoes on. Another thing I learned was if I am wearing headphones, if I see a cop, to pull off the headphones. I'm not going to say I learned wonderful lessons. I'm just saying I learned, lessons. And there's probably a dozen other lessons I could rattle off that I learned. And if you deny the child the opportunity to learn those lessons by micromanaging and helicoptering, then you're just putting off those lessons that they have to learn themselves to a later age. So you could be 30 years old and you haven't learned any of those lessons yet. Another lesson I learned, probably the most important one, is I made it through, because there was a moment there when my parents were yelling at me about what I had done, and it just felt like my whole life was over. I remember thinking, I'm probably never going to be allowed to drive again. Will I ever be able to get my license back? Am I going to go to prison? It felt really bad. But I bucked up and pulled my pants up and said, okay, well, I face the music and let's do that. And at the age of 16 and a half, at the end of that, I felt like, okay, I managed that. That was a pretty bad situation that I got in. It was my fault that I was in it, but I was in a bad situation and I made it through. And then when I paid off the debt that I had incurred from it, it felt good. It's like, okay, I paid the price. I lived through it and I can do it. So the next time something like that would happen, where I would make a mistake and a consequence would happen, I had this, at least in the back of my mind, as evidence that I can do it. I can manage. It will be hard, but I will manage. So that's an important lesson, that someone could tell you that, oh, you're competent, you're a good person. And that doesn't mean much. We have to experience it. We have to experience that we're a good person. We have to experience that we can make it, that we're strong. And the only way that can happen is if we make mistakes and bump up against the hard reality of the world. Now, this doesn't mean you just throw your 16-year-old off the deep end, figuratively, in terms of freedoms and consequences, but there should be an age-appropriate, gradual transition to adulthood that a lot of people are denied for various different reasons. And then they grow up and marry an overfunctioner who's codependent, and the pattern continues. So So for you, the dependent avoidant person, for you and your partner, it's just really important that has to be worked out, and you have to push yourself. You have to, and this is where therapy helps, but you actually have to put yourself out there, because, and the other thing that when I worked with dependent avoidant people, when I work with them, is that you have to look inside of yourself and find, often it's quite suppressed, the part of you that wants to be competent, that wants to be able to walk around the adult world and manage themselves. You have to, because it's one thing to be like, well, okay, I have to become competent. It's another thing to be internally motivated. Yeah. And for dependent avoidant people, sometimes that part of them has been so suppressed because it needed to be when they were growing up because of the way they were treated. So you have to find that core motivation. I want to be independent. I want to learn how to cope. I want to break the chain of believing that I can't do things, and think about how good it will feel when you have 5 years down, you're 5 years down the line, and you feel strong, you feel competent, you feel like you're standing on a foundation of your own experience, and you'll make mistakes and there will be adversity, but you'll make it through because you've proven to yourself that you can do it without asking for help. And maybe sometimes you do ask for help, but you can manage on your own if you need to. That's an important part. And so for the codependent person, they have to learn that they're a worthy human being even when they're not helping someone. They're just worthy. They're lovable, all on their own. They don't have to be helpful or demanding of someone else. They don't have to be micromanaging someone else to be a worthy, lovable, non-abandonable human being. All right. Well, I thought I was going to get to more questions, but the Discord questions were so good that I only got to 3, I think. Anyway, well, actually, let's see if I can get to a few more while I'm on this stuff. Okay, so Nebelung says, I watched the Jimena episode where you explained it's possible people, so this is 90 Day Fiancé Jimena, it's possible people like her convince themselves that they are bored because after a certain threshold they get uncomfortable due to past trauma. For me, so I was talking about how if you've been traumatized growing up and in your adult life, in dating and romantic relationships, sometimes when you finally meet someone, and I'm not saying that Mike was one of those individuals, but sometimes when you meet someone who is actually healthy for you, it will feel very boring. And because it's so non-chaotic and it's so unfamiliar, and it relates to what I was saying earlier in terms of predictive identification, that one, we will recreate past relationships, good or bad, because it's comfortable to us, and two, because we need to create those relationships in order to externalize, right? And say the previous person who was dependent avoidant matches up with someone that's not codependent and not an overt functioner. Well, they might, it's not always the case, but they might feel like they might not even really fall in love, because sometimes when our feelings of love are actually motivated by our recognition that this individual is a good target for our predictive identification, because it feels very familiar, it feels reminiscent of the quote unquote love we had when we were growing up with our caregivers. Anyway, and if the dependent avoidant person matches someone who's not codependent, they're not able to recreate. They try to recreate their past relationship by sucking in their partner to be codependent for them, and the other person resists it because they don't have needs along those lines. And the way it will consciously feel is boredom. But what's sometimes happening is the inability to use predictive identification. So that's what I was talking about. And Nebelon goes on, for me, I have a similar issue. I had serial dated before, Problem is, once the vulnerability goes down, I have no motivation to get back with a previous partner. Do people like this always want to go back to the previous partner once vulnerability goes down? It hasn't happened to me yet. So yeah, I'm not really sure what you're referring to. Vulnerability. For me, I was someone I'd date serious. Problem is, once the vulnerability goes down, I have no motivation to get back with a previous partner. Do people like this always want to go back? Previous partner. So I think you inserted a word there that kind of made a positive a negative. But I think what you're saying is that when you're in a relationship that is difficult, what some people might call toxic, you date a new person, and in the beginning it can kind of feel compelling, but very quickly you get bored and you want to go back with your previous partner. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, obviously, but it could be related to all the things I was mentioning earlier. Blink Blackstar on Reddit asked, has the doctor made an episode about oversharing? I have this problem, and to be honest, I'd like to know the science behind it. End of question. Well, I mean, science, there's not a lot of science behind that, but the thinking is that it could be attributed to a lot of things. One is narcissism, right? Because you were raised in a way that made you feel like you weren't worth it, and you compensated by convincing yourself you're very, very, very worth it. And you're also quite self-centered because you needed to be, because you weren't being treated in a way of interactions. There weren't a lot with narcissistic people. There's a period of time, 0 to 3, 0 to 4, where they're just kind of left alone a lot emotionally, and they haven't developed the neurons that involve back and forth with other people, and so narcissistic people are very internal. They don't really notice other people as much because of that reason. Anyway, so that could be one reason. Another is hyperactivity. If you're amped up or manic as well, you could just be a chattermouth, if you will. But I think what you're talking about is oversharing, meaning like too much information kind of a thing. Possibly that's what we're referring to. And, that's kind of cultural. In some circles, you can really talk a lot about whatever you want to. And in other circles, it's unseemly to talk about more personal things, which I prefer the latter, or the prior, obviously, and always have. Like, I swear to God, like 99% of the time when someone says, oh my God, TMI, I always cringe. I'm just like, really? Like, I don't know. I grew up in a family where we talked about, I didn't know it at the time, but I grew up in a family where we talked pretty openly about, I don't know, just human things. And when I get around my family, and we're hanging out, I notice that about us. And it's particularly led by my mom and my sister, my older sister. They both will disclose a lot of things that other people wouldn't disclose, if that makes sense. So anyway, I don't know if that's what you're talking about, though. But if you have more to that question, go ahead and email in. All right, Octavia asked, have you ever done an episode on Inside Out? I searched Patreon and found an episode that includes it in your top 10 psychological movies, but nothing that focuses on Inside Out exclusively. End of question. Yeah, we did the psychology of Inside Out when the movie came out in 2015. So there's an episode in July of 2015 that we did it, the psychology of Inside Out. I love that movie. And I agree that it's a very psychological movie, and one of my favorite movies, regardless of the psychological content. You might have seen a picture that I took with Bob where I have a figure of Joy that's on my bookshelf behind me. But anyway, so but the question about like how to find episodes, you always want to go to the website, and I would never search on Patreon. Patreon is an awful place to find an episode. So the best thing you can do is go to our website and go to the episodes tab, and literally every episode by title is listed there, and then you can just do a search by word. And that's what I did actually, because I was like, I'm pretty sure we did an episode on Inside Out. So I just went to the list of episodes page, and I searched for Inside Out, and sure as stuff, there it is. And then once you find it there, you often can just listen to that episode on the website itself, or trying to find it on Patreon though, not convenient. And people have been complaining about that aspect of Patreon for years, and I still do. Whenever they reach out to me, I'm always eventually I'll and I've gotten pretty frustrated with them, honestly, on this level, because the amount of money that Patreon is making from podcasts, it's got to be astronomical. And of course, Patreon has a lot of different types of content creators, art, and other kinds of people. But I find that Patreon is much more geared towards art and like people who do something once a month sort of thing, like a tattoo artist or a short story writer, a documentarian, this kind of thing. And podcasts have episodes once a week, 5 times a week, and Patreon's ability to make it easy to find an episode is not good. And they've known about it for a long time, and I've been telling about this because in fact, soon I was asked by Patreon to give a talk to their employees, and I'm going to give a lecture on attachment, and I might mention this to them. Be like, yeah, you're still not geared towards podcasters. It's not hard. Just get a UI specialist in here and help us out, like a search function. There might even be a search function now. I don't know, but anyway. So yeah, go to the website, and then you can listen on Patreon. You can listen on YouTube. You can listen on podcast feed on your phone. You can go to Spreaker, actually, because that's where our feed resides. You can go to Spotify, listen to episodes there. Anyway, Nebelong also asked Dr. Kirk, what's your daily routine? Well, yeah, in brief, I do have a routine. I mean, I don't know if I can generalize well, because every day does have differences, but generally speaking, there are some routinized aspects. I wake up at about 8-ish, maybe 8:30, sometimes 7, because I go to bed around 1 o'clock in 1 a.m. So I wake up about 8:30, and then I will go upstairs, and Stacy's already up because she gets up earlier than I do, and Stacy brings the dogs into her office and closes the door because the dogs are less likely to bark in that situation. And because if the dogs start barking, it wakes me up. And if I wake up at 6:30, it's hard for me to go back to bed. And then I'm sort of wrecked for that whole day. So she does that for me. And then, so I get up, and I can hear the little dog starting to freak out because she wants to see me. She's a very exuberant greeter. And so I will open the door and let her out, the little dog. But because if I have both dogs, they kind of compete with each other, and it gets annoying. And so I like to love on one dog at a time. And so I let the little dog out, and then I go into my office on the rug, and she wants to lick my face. So she licks my face for, sometimes a long time, sometimes a short time, but she's real excited to see me. And then it's fun to be greeted that way in the morning. And then I go into Stacy's office. This is a lot of detail, by the way, but I don't know. I like to describe it. Then I go into Stacy's office, and I will love on the bigger dog, and then I kiss and hug Stacy in the morning, depending on our breath situation. But you got to make it happen. Check in with each other a little bit, and then I'll probably sit there on her little step, and she's usually on her computer, and so there's we'll check in. This morning I told her about the dream I had. This childhood friend of mine, I was with a crowd of 10 people, and a childhood friend of mine started talking about how he wanted the United States to invade Russia or something like this, and I blurted out and just started yelling at him. I was just like, "You're a fucking idiot. you want to go to war? You're dumb. You're an idiot. And soon after, I just felt bad for just ridiculing him. But in my head, in the dream, the way he was talking, it seemed like if I didn't respond, it would happen. In a weird, it's just a guy talking about politics, but somehow it felt like if I don't shut this down, we will invade Russia and we're all going to die. So, I was telling Stacy about that, and then we will sometimes talk about just random stuff, what we're going to do in the day, or sometimes podcast stuff. Sometimes she's real frustrated with something with her spa in Manhattan. She has a spa, Daphne, I think Lower Manhattan, and because she's part owner, and so and she's quite involved in like hiring and firing and products and just oversight of everything at the spa, skincare spa in New York. Anyway, so sometimes we'll talk about that. And then I will go for a walk, and I like to walk hills because it gives me a lot of cardio. I don't like running. I've never liked running. I like walking, and so if I'm walking up a hill, it feels totally fine, but I'm real huff. There's a really steep hill by where I live, and so I do that, and then I shower. I'm just describing this morning, actually, which is kind of typical. And then I sit down at my computer, and I start to kind of deal with all the little errands you have to do with like emails and I don't know, just little things. And then I start to, once all that is done, and that can take a while, sometimes that will take, I don't know, 5 hours. There might be a few episodes I have to edit, or sometimes I'll check the numbers on YouTube or on the podcast, or on TikTok or something. I just started on TikTok not long ago. So, there's a lot of podcasts, little accoutrement that you have to attend to, and then I'm sort of gearing up to where I have a number of hours of essentially free time that I can actually work on a project for the podcast, whether it's a deep dive or like this episode where I'm yammering and or a video or something, and because I need a long stretch of time. I can't do this for just 45 minutes. I have to have a lot of time to I don't know, get into the zone, I guess. And so I'll do that, and at some point I'll have a snack, and at some point, and then usually around 4, Stacy and I will have dinner. I know that sounds like an old person thing. It's like, why are you having dinner so early? But because she wakes up so early, that's kind of, and dinners are kind of big meal, and we have it together and da-da-da. So we'll, half the time, I don't know, lately, I feel like 90% of the time we'll just get takeout or delivery, or some, I don't know. So there's a fair amount of eating out. We don't really cook at home that much anymore. I think because the pandemic, that's all we did, was cook at home, that we're so sick of it. And so even though the pandemic is essentially, we've been going to restaurants essentially for a year, minus Omicron months. And, but somehow I still savor the fact that we can go to restaurants and whatnot. So, and then after dinner, I will often work more because I'm pretty energetic at night, and Stacy's definitely starting to, die off with her energy. Sometimes we'll go for a walk or something with the dogs, and by the way, Stacy is while I'm working, she is helping the dogs a lot. She's letting them out. She's picking up their poop. She's walking them. She's taking them to the vet. She's entertaining them because, the 2 dogs are pretty young and they require a lot of attention. And so sometimes I'll jump in and be with them in that way. And and then I'll work. Sometimes Stacy and I watch a movie or a TV show or something. We're watching Ted Lasso right now. Ted Lasso, everyone was talking about how great it was, and I started watching it a number of months ago and was like, yeah, cute, but it didn't really grab me. And then it won all the Emmys, and then everyone's like, oh, it's the best show of all time. Umberto was talking about how much he loved it and how much it reminded him of me. He was like, oh my God, that show, it just is you. The messages, it's all about you. And I'm like, huh? So I started watching it because I'm like, well, I guess I got to watch this thing. And I like it. It's great, but it's not, I don't know. Maybe people were talking it up too much or something. Maybe I needed to discover how good it was on my own. But yeah, it's a good show. It makes me cry frequently, but I don't know. It doesn't really grab me. And one hypothesis I had about it was that it is too familiar to me, or the sentiment of Ted Lasso, the character. He's just this really forgiving, I don't know, fun person with pain. He suffers, and maybe it is just like I'm watching. I mean, not me, because I'm not that good of a person, that's for sure. But I don't know. So yeah, it's a good show. And then late at night, to wind down, typically I'm either playing a video game with Berto, like Age of Empires, or there's actually this Bloons game. I think it's like Bloons TD6 or something. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a tower defense game, and I like tower defense games, but typically I get real bored with them at some point because I kind of figured out. But this Bloons game, it looks like a child's game, but it's good. Like, I loved Plants vs. Zombies. Man, I played through that game like 5 times, just started over and just played through it again. I just love that game. And it's kind of like that to me. It's real cartoony and interface is satisfying. Anyway, so I'll play a video game, or I will watch YouTube. And there's a number of channels that I follow. Recently, I think I talked about this in an episode with Berto. I've been watching a lot of William Osman videos. I just find him to be a delight. And because there's a lot of, he's an engineer. He's a young engineer type of guy, and he makes like funny engineer. Like, there's this, he'll say, okay, how do we, like, he made a gravy train where he figured out how to make a train that would go on the dinner table at Thanksgiving, and it would, by remote, it would squirt gravy onto people's plates. Hijinks ensue, and it's very charming, and it moves fast, and yeah. So I'll watch something like that, or I'll watch like a history YouTube video, or I don't know. There's various different YouTube channels that I watch, and then at some point around 12 o'clock, I think, I should go to bed. Then I go to bed, and then I will look at Reddit. That's my time where I sort of mindlessly scroll through Reddit. And I subscribe to a lot of channels that, or I subscribe to a lot of subreddits that, like there's AWW, which is a lot of cute animals, and other kinds of things, psychology subreddits, that sort of stuff. And I lurk. I don't comment, because in the past I would comment or post, and it never went well. I don't know how to communicate in that form. People would misunderstand me and get hurt or upset at me, and I'd be I'm just not made for this. And I kind of marvel at how well people can get a point across in that format. Anyway, and then I drift off and wake up, and Leia's there licking my face in the morning, and it all starts all over again. I mean, when I say it out loud in that way, it sounds tedious, but it's not. I love my life. I mean, I've engineered it specifically this way, and eliminated other things, like, working at the university was great, but, there were overall more of a downside, because I wasn't home with the dogs, and I wasn't able to do podcasting. And so now there, of course, are days when I'm seeing my clients. There are times when I'm actually teaching, but it, doesn't really change that routine that I just told you. And for some of you, you might just be like, "Well, that sounds real boring," but it's not. It's really great. Sprinkle in, I'll go to a movie with Stacy or Berto or something, or we'll go out to dinner. Stacy and I went out to dinner last night. So yeah, I mean, there's other kinds of things, but yeah, I don't know. I guess I feel a little embarrassed that I just revealed my daily routine, because it just sounds such like an old person routine. But the freedom! It's just so great to be, because the other part of it, well, I didn't mention this. The other part of it is I will almost always take a nap. In fact, I am flagging. Like right now, it's about 12:45, and it's definitely nap time for me. So I need. When I was working at the university and I was getting older and I was having that urge to take a nap, I would sometimes just have to go to my car in the garage and try to take a nap. My energy post, afternoon really depends on my ability to just fall asleep for even just like 5 minutes. And working from home and having that flexibility with my schedule allows me to be able to do that. And it really would bring me down if I, was forced to be in a schedule where I couldn't take that nap, or sometimes I take 2 or 3 naps because I'm having a real bad day. I don't know if I've ever told you all about that, but getting old sucks, and energy level starts to wane and your brain starts to go. And so having, more control over my schedule, gives me the ability to kind of adjust. If I'm having a bad day, I can just sort of scale back. And so that's another reason that I have this real, I don't know, open-ended, easy life. But, during the podcast, it's just not always easy. I don't know why I have to somehow justify to y'all that I'm working hard. One could argue I am, one could argue I'm not. I don't know. You can make your own call. But anyway, let's take a break. And when we get back, I have an interview that I was on another podcast, and I'll play that. But first, let's take a break. Hey, deserving listeners, today's episode is sponsored by HelloFresh. When you sign up, use the code Seattle16. HelloFresh sends you easy-to-make meal kits delivered right to your door every week. Ingredients travel from farm to your doorstep in under a week, so they're always fresh, all without having to leave your house, which appeals to me because I hate running errands. Puts me in a bad mood, to be honest. HelloFresh is super flexible. You can skip weeks when you need to. You can pick your favorites from 50 different weekly options. In our house, we love all the recipes, but some of them that are really great are the citrus beef tacos, their barbecue sloppy joes, and their pizzas. Me and my pizzas. So go to HelloFresh.com/Seattle16, that's Seattle16, and use the code Seattle16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/Seattle16 and use the code Seattle16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. And remember that HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. All right, we're back from the break. So I recently was on someone else's podcast, and usually I will share the interviews with y'all because sometimes we get into things that I don't typically think about or to talk about. And I recently did that, though, a couple weeks ago, and shared with you an interview that I had with a student, actually, that was practicing how to do write-ups, and if you remember that. But so when I did this podcast and I got the audio, I thought, well, I just did that, and we kind of got into similar topics, so I don't want to bore the listeners with me yammering about the same things. But I edited it down a bit so that it didn't have a lot of repeat, but I thought I would have it at the end of the episode, so if you're not really interested in hearing me go over things that maybe you've heard me go over before, you could just end it now and not listen to the rest. But I don't know. I feel like it was an interesting interview, and the interviewer was great. His name is Mike Davis, and he produces the weekly podcast Humans of Purpose from Australia. Humans of Purpose podcast. It says here that it features conversations with purpose-driven leaders whose work is having a major social impact. So you can go to humansofpurpose.com. So I'm going to play that interview right now. Let me know what you think.
Absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dr. Kirk Honda. Welcome to the podcast, Kirk.
Thanks for having me.
I am obsessed with your show. I think your YouTube channel is incredible. You're obviously a lot more than that. You've got a private practice. You do some fantastic work professionally. But my wife really got me into your show, and you are part of the reason why I find such fascination with reality TV and observing the human condition. So, double-edged sword, I want to say thank you, but also, why did you do this to me?
Well, you can blame my viewers because they were the ones that encouraged me to do it on YouTube. So I guess you and I can both blame the fans for getting us both into reality TV. But it's so interesting. There's so much to talk about with it.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. But I think maybe a good place to start, sort of what we regularly do on Humans of Purpose, is just to talk a little bit about how you decide. Did you always know you wanted to do psychology?
When I was in high school, I excelled in math and science and chemistry and physics. And so it was natural that I would go to college and try to find a career in that. A lot of people in my family worked at Boeing in Seattle. It's at least used to be the headquarters. I don't know if it is anymore, but there's still a lot of Boeing employees in the area. And my dad had worked at Boeing and for like 45 plus years. And so he was really interested in me becoming an engineer at Boeing. My skills were in that area. I went to university and studied engineering in the beginning and very quickly realized that the career wasn't for me because it just sounds so boring because it was just, sitting in front of a draft table. So I abruptly changed midstream to business because I didn't know what else to do. And my oldest sister, got a business degree from the same school of business, Foster School of Business at University of Washington. And so I thought, well, my sister did it, so I'll just do what she did. I figured, well, I have a greater chance of this degree working out because a lot of things involve business skills, right? Because there's a lot of jobs that happen at businesses. I fell into that. I'm 19 years old, have no idea what I'm doing. Then I started to get interested in marketing, actually, because you could argue marketing is kind of like the psychology of business. And then I specialize in that. I graduate and I cannot find a job. I'm just like, no one wants to hire me. I didn't know you're supposed to get an internship and you're supposed to network. I basically, because this is before the internet, I basically just opened up the newspaper looking for a job and would send resumes and was getting no offers. And then I ended up working at the Foot Locker. It's a shoe store.
Oh, we know Foot Locker.
Oh, okay. So I worked at a Foot Locker downtown Seattle. So I have a bachelor's in business from one of the best business schools in the nation. And I'm working for like $250 an hour, 6 days a week on commission only. And I have a boss that is just like a complete a-hole. And I'm like, boy, I've really hit an all-time low at this point. Oh, and then fast forward a little bit later, and I've even hit a lower low when I become a dishwasher at a pizza restaurant with a bachelor's degree. I'm just like, what's wrong with me? Well, then things took a turn, and I ended up getting a job as a market researcher at a hospital, and then eventually at a firm, a market researching firm, and that was really fun. I had an office and a computer, and I wore a suit to work, and I was in charge of things, and I'm 23 years old, and I'm feeling like I'm hot crap. I'm like, okay, I kind of see my life head up before me. I'm still living like a college student. I now have a little bit of extra money, and so I'm actually buying all this like musical equipment and stuff. I just felt like like Mr. Moneybags, even though I think I was earning like $12 an hour or something, but comparatively, it was a lot of money. And so I am in traffic on a highway in Seattle area, and bumper to bumper, I'm just sitting there driving home from work, and I am daydreaming about the rest of my life. And I see it all kind of stretched out before me. I see my 20s working up to associate. I see, my 30s, maybe breaking off into having my own market researching firm, my 50s, retirement, having a yacht or whatever it is that rich people in business do. And I kind of liked it. It seemed like a good life. I liked the work. It was dynamic. Market research involves a lot of product and working with various different clients and helping them to know their customers better. And it felt interesting and dynamic. But it just didn't seem very fulfilling to me. And I'm just sitting there in traffic, and I'm just like, well, on my deathbed, is that what I want to look back on? A life that I'm seeing now at the age of 24, just stretched out before me. And I said, that's not really what I want to see. So I started to daydream about other kinds of jobs. This is perhaps the very first time in my life when I just thought about what kind of career should I have, at the age of 24. I had kind of fallen into things because of desperation and lack of having any idea what I want to do. But this is the first time when I really stopped to think like, well, what do I want to do for the rest of my life? A third of our life is spent at work. And what do I want to do with my life? And I thought, well, I've always wanted to be a music teacher. That popped into my head. But then I thought, well, I don't want to have to wrangle kids because I don't want to be a disciplinarian. And by the way, when I played trumpet as a kid, we had a teacher that we tortured with our rambunctiousness. And I think that was in my head. And so I thought, music teacher, not for me. And then I thought therapist just popped into my head. I started, therapist. I've never thought about it because that's not my identity. No one I know was thinking about becoming a therapist or even in psychology. I started to try it on. And at first I'm like, well, come on, a therapist, that's ridiculous. But the more I thought about it, I was like, oh my God, this fits with so many parts of my personality. I love to talk. I love to listen. I love to explore. I love meaning. I like to help people. I like one-on-one conversations. I've always been obsessed with, like in high school, I would sneak out at night, not to go drink with my buddies, but to sit down with my best friends and just talk. We would just sit there sober until 6 a.m, just talking about the existence of life. And I was like, is that? And I also kind of like detective work. At the time I thought, well, maybe psychology is kind of like a detective case where you're trying to figure things out. I perceived, and I was accurate, that once in private practice, I'd be able to dictate my own schedule, because that was another part of it, was this 9 to 5. I'm not a morning person. And I was really, it was actually 8 to 5. And I had to, get up at like 6 or something to get to, battle traffic to get to work. And so a large part of this motivation was like, I can't do this traffic and these hours anymore. I need a job. And therapists probably are able to dictate their hours, which is true. And within a week, I was looking into programs, and within a few months, 6 months or so, I was in a program, and I never looked back. It's always been a love of mine, this career. And I'm just so happy that I was stuck in traffic that one day.
I love that story. And I like how we just took a full journey from Foot Locker and pizza dishwasher all the way through to accomplished therapist and, professional broadcaster. That's a really exciting journey you've mapped. But I particularly like how, what strikes me about the way you tell the story is it seems like you have this fascination with the human condition from quite the outset. So marketing, trying to understand consumer behavior, enjoying the long discussions and conversations, trying to figure out where other people are coming from. And you also bring, I think, a real empathy to what you do. And I think it's just apparent from watching your videos and not having been in session with you, but you seem like a person who's quite curious, empathetic, and really gets sparked or energized by trying to work out what's going on in someone else's head and the relationship dynamics. Would that be a good assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know where that comes from. Some people would say it's because I'm a middle child. Maybe I would say it's because when I was born into my family, my older brother and sister were like 6 and 7 years older than me. And I remember feeling this way, like there was my mom and dad, and there was my older brother and sister who were relating to each other. And then I was like off in the corner, not really able to relate. And I observed a lot. And people would comment, and it's kind of a funny story in my family lore that when I was, 3 years old, I had this look on my face where it looked like I was dissecting people's minds or something, which it just sounds bizarre. But so I think that might have been why. It's like, well, no one's playing with me, so I guess I'll just watch them and try and figure them out.
So through your work, I have a bit of a vague theory, and it could be completely wrong, that perhaps people who work in your space, through their work and through your work, do you feel that you start to understand and see things in other people and other dynamics and situations that you can then be self-reflective and you kind of get to know yourself better? Is that part of it?
Oh, yeah, 100%. So a lot of my growth and self-awareness has been created not only that way, but also as I teach or as I podcast. A lot of therapy for myself has been done outside of a therapy office or when I'm being a therapist. And a prime example of this is that frequently happens, honestly, is I'll be talking with a couple about intimacy and communication and giving each other the benefit of the doubt and being vulnerable. The session will end and I work from home. So, and my wife does as well. And so I'll just, my session will be over and I'll just go to my wife and just like sort of do what I was telling my other couple to do,
Yeah, that's amazing. You said that it took about 5 or 7 years to actually take off what you were doing. So how do you, for me, my podcast is still in its kind of infancy, even though it's been 5 years. So I think a lot of people don't understand the amount of work that goes into doing something for the love of doing something without any reward for a long time. Do you put it down to stubborn persistence that you believe something will eventually work, or what was it for you that kept you going?
Well, why do you go on? Why do you do it?
I think for me, I strongly believe in the value of the offering. I believe that it can help people. I believe that, if it gets listened to and discovered, people will learn about how they can consider their life in a different way, or their pathway, or where they might be moving, that can help enliven a purpose, personal or professional, and help them to really self-actualize. So that's sort of why I do it. And I think that whenever I think about pulling out of doing it, I keep thinking, well, there is more great stories of people to tell that can help a lot of other people learn and grow. So that was for me.
Yeah, well, good. Yeah, you have a purpose, a bigger meaning in it. You're trying to be altruistic to others. I'm sure others are listening and are benefiting in this way. The way I will tell, someone actually was consulting with me yesterday about their podcast that they're starting. And what I will tell people is, in the beginning, there relatively no one will be listening, but that isn't to say no one will be listening. You might have 100 or 200 people. And in my world, as a professor and lecturer, if I can get just 10 people to show up to one of my lectures, an optional lecture at my university, that's a huge success. So the fact that you have 100 or 200 people, which is, in internet terms, just basically zero, that's a lot of people that you could be touching their lives. And I think that's incredibly important. But yeah, for me, for whatever reason, when I started the podcast, I became obsessed with it. And I listened to podcasts, and I always have. And people would ask, and I think you were kind of referring to this, they would say, like, why are you doing it? And I would say, like, well, I don't know. I just love to do it. There were a lot of benefits from it. One was I was learning things. 2, it was a creative outlet. 3, I always kind of felt like it would be a catalog or an archive of my work. For therapists, there are so many amazing moments in therapy that happen. As a client in therapy, you might be able to attest to this, like really just mind-blowing moments and that will happen behind closed doors in therapy. But no one ever sees it for good reason, and they shouldn't. But therapy to the outside world can be very mysterious. And I just wanted some kind of record of like what therapy is actually like and what a therapist might say. One more aspect in my very long, brief answer is I always believed, and so I say this for you and other people that might be, in these kinds of phases of a creative project. I always believed that it would be bigger, when it was very, very small and I just had 100 people paying attention and like a good number of them were my friends and family. I just always thought, I think I can make something that would be helpful to people. I think I can make something that would be meaningful to people. And I kept honing it and kept pushing and sort of hustling on how to get the word out and, just experimenting with all these different marketing things. And 99.9% of the things did not work. but occasionally something does work, and then it would take off. And I was like, yes, I always knew it, that I always knew it was good, and no one was paying attention. And, I hear other people who are obviously way more successful than me that will have a similar thought, that like Steve Jobs, for example, I don't know, but I imagine he probably said something, and I don't want to compare myself to Steve Jobs, but I feel like success sometimes depends on a delusional belief that what you have is good, even though there's no evidence from the outside that it is.
Yeah, totally. And I think you need, it's almost, I'm tempted here to go down Elizabeth Holmes territory, but I'll kind of resist for now. But how does that feel for you now to sort of see what you do and kind of, no one, maybe a few people believed in it, mainly yourself at the beginning, but now you put up a video and, your community is just rampant. You got thousands and thousands of people watching, full of comments, lots of sort of user or viewer feedback. What's that feel like?
Oh, so many feelings. One is it was so slow, Mike, from 2008 to 2022, that every step along the way was a celebration, but not a huge one, right? There were tiny little leaps, so to speak, but it's been this really steady growth every week, just grinding and getting a bigger audience. If you have sudden fame, it can feel like it's inevitable. You don't treasure it. You don't protect it. You're not careful with it. There's that, but it also can be overwhelming. And someone asked me the other day, a fan was asking if I wanted things to be bigger and what I would do to achieve that. And I had coincidentally recently thought about that and concluded I did not want it to get bigger, because I love where it's at right now. I don't want this scrutiny. One, the internet can be a cruel place, and I've experienced a little bit of that. And I feel like if I was bigger, I'd get more of that. Also, I don't want to have it feel like it's such a big crowd of fans that I can't really relate to any one of them. My fan base is small enough, at least the sort of core group, such that I can know their names and I can email with them and I can DM with them and, see them at a live event, remember them. Whereas if it got bigger, I think it would lose that.
And what's it like for you day to day? You live in Seattle?
Yes.
So how is your life now since it's got big? Do you kind of walk around and get recognized on the street? How often would you be recognized publicly when you're not expecting it?
Well, it happens occasionally. It's not very frequent. One time, someone was shy and I was parking outside the university. And when I got back to my car, they left a really long, really lovely note it was in my, windshield wipers. And I felt like a secret admirer was like watching me all the time. So that happened. Another time, it's fascinating. I was at a bar actually and talking with some friends, and someone walked by and then they came back and they said, "Are you Dr. Kirk?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "I didn't know what you look like, but I could tell by your voice because I listened to your podcast." And I was like, really? Without knowing what I looked like, by me just having a conversation with my friends, you could detect that it was me.
Oh yeah, Kirk, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I'm quite an oral person, so I get a lot of I like audiobooks, I like podcasts, I like the human voice. I get that a lot when I ring people and they are podcast listeners. They will say, "Are you Mike Davis?" And I will say, "Yes, it's me." And they'll do the whole freak out thing. It's weird because I was just listening to your podcast. But I think voices are an incredible thing. And I think if I was that person in that bar and walked past you, I would recognize you from your face. But also hearing your voice, Louise, my wife, would be definitely recognizing that. And especially if you were making like a bit of discussion about reality TV, like 90 Day Fiancé or something, she would be all over that.
Yeah. So a lot of my fame actually occurred during the pandemic, and it hasn't been put to the test how well I'll be recognized on the street. Although I will say that I have been out and about and haven't been recognized. Although someone lives in my neighborhood, actually, a fan lives pretty close by when I'm walking the dogs. she'll say hi, and she's always really nice. She doesn't like, I feel like she's trying not to invade my space, but I don't really feel like that would happen. But I'll tell you, Mike, so I went to Disneyland with Umberto a couple weeks ago, and we were there for 4 days, and there's millions of people there. It's packed. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get recognized, it'll probably happen here. Right. And I never got recognized. And at the end of it, I have to say, I was talking with my wife about this. On one hand, I was happy because I don't know. I want to be able to be myself. I don't want to have to worry, like, am I making a fool out of myself right now? But on the other hand, I was slightly disappointed that no one recognized me.
That's hilarious.
Because it hasn't happened that often that I'm annoyed by it because I'm sure a certain level of celebrity, it just gets annoying that people come up to you. Like, I'm definitely not at that stage.
How did you decide that you wanted to start engaging with reality TV? What was sort of the moment where you thought, wow, this would be really interesting to analyze and deconstruct for an audience? Yeah.
Well, in brief, I didn't really watch reality TV. It just wasn't for me. One, I just don't watch a lot of TV. And two, I just never really found it interesting. And it's hard to get into, I think. Now that I watch it, there's a barrier of entry that I feel like once you cross the line, and maybe you can attest to this, Mike, you kind of know the language of reality TV, and it's more familiar, and it makes it more palatable. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, I think to some extent. I mean, some shows just pull you right in because conceptually they're fascinating. I mean, I think there are shows like, I will say, I heard about 90 Day Fiancé from a podcast, and you can't really get it in Australia very easily, but I started to download it, and I just thought, this is a fascinating social experiment. Is this person really in love with this person, or do they just want to come to America? And I thought that was just a really fascinating thing to film that, and kind of like also maybe a little bit voyeuristic and bordering on morally wrong to put people in that situation. But as an observer, just incredible television. And then I don't think there were too many other shows that I liked. There was Love After Lockup, which I thought was fascinating because, who is looking to engage in relationships with people in prison? It sort of seems like a strange choice, and vice versa. And then The Ultimatum, which we just watched recently, I thought was incredibly close to the line of what would be morally okay and what wouldn't be. And I think that pushing that line, it's always getting pushed closer to this place of, are we putting people in a really unethical social experiment? So there's a voyeurism there, but I think, I think for me, it's just about trying to understand dynamics and power. I think power relations play a big part in all of this. And yeah, I mean, what do you sort of take from these shows that is kind of takes your interest and elevates it enough to do full commentary on episodes?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's in conversation with the fans, with the viewers, because I wouldn't be doing it if it weren't for them.
So they asked you to do it? Was that sort of how it began?
Yeah, well, so the pandemic started, Netflix came out with their very first, I think, or at least first heavily promoted reality TV show called Love is Blind.
Oh, yeah.
Almost exactly 2 years ago, actually. And me and my wife were just stuck at home, no socializing, no going to restaurants. And so we had all this time on our hands, and it just felt like, well, maybe we could get into a television show, and it was kind of trending, this Love is Blind thing. So I started watching it, and I like I said, rarely had I ever seen any reality TV. And instantly, as I was watching it in the living room, I thought, there is so much I could be saying about this in a podcast. It's just a perfect grist for the mill. And I, at some point, maybe later that night, dusted off my webcam because I don't really do that kind of thing. And it was this really bad old Logitech thing, and just sort of propped it up on something and figured out how to do a reaction video, and then posted it thinking, maybe a few of the fans will like this. But, like I said earlier, I experimented with so many different things to try to push the thing forward. And this was just another one of those things. And there was no reason to believe that anyone would care. But it took off, and it was overwhelming. This was one of the few times where there was a very sudden surge in popularity. Fast forward just a few weeks, and the cast members, were DMing me and saying, thank you for what you said, or so-and-so hates you. He watches it now and he hates you, or whatever. With this new group of fans on YouTube, they were demanding that I watch 90 Day Fiancé, and I'd never heard of it before. So I started watching it and fell in love with the show, I guess similar to how you described it, and realized, because, as a professor, I've been trying to teach my students how to do therapy. And one of the things that will help to teach students how to do therapy is to have real life examples of human beings that we can talk about, right? And so there are instructional DVDs and videos of therapy with real human beings or actors, and they're really poorly produced. They're boring. They're often from like the 70s or 80s, where everyone's hair is weird, and it puts all the students off. And when I'm watching these reality TV shows, it's like those are real people. Now, occasionally it's staged and whatnot, but there's a lot of moments where it, at least to me, looks extremely real and represents exactly what happens with my clients. And it gives me a chance to actually apply all the things that I teach about with these actual human beings. And then, as you were talking about earlier, this sort of side effect happened, which is, and maybe I intended this, I don't know, people watch it and then they apply it to their own lives, because all of us have some couple on that show that we're struggling with part of their issues. And when I talk about these things, people say, oh, actually, that's kind of like me. You're talking about him, but it's actually, you're also kind of talking about me. And it gives people a chance to contemplate things and to have compassion for themselves. And again, maybe seek therapy. And yeah, what a big deal, what a wonderful thing that is. And when I wake up in the morning, that's what gets me out of bed. It's like, okay, let's create content to reach one more person so that they can live a happier life of vulnerability and compassion and attachment security. It really motivates me.
And I'm just wondering about sort of the insights that you gain from both watching and commentating on these shows and then your private practice. Is it a bi-directional kind of relationship? Like, does one help you become more proficient in the other, or does your private practice help you be better at making these videos and commentary?
Absolutely. It is a bi-directional and maybe tri-directional with being a professor, that a lot of what I've learned as a clinician in terms of conceptual learning and literature review is from the podcast. Because as a therapist, you're just grinding session by session by session. You don't have a lot of time to research concepts and learn new things. I mean, there is continuing education, but it's few and far between. As a professor, you have a little bit more time to learn, but still you're teaching classes, typically the same classes over and over and over again. You learn that material well, but you don't have a lot of time to go outside that material. But podcasting, every episode of the audio podcast anyway, is about something new. I mean, not always something new, but frequently about something new. And so I have this treasure trove of topics that I personally just want to learn myself. And through that learning, then I can create an episode. And of course, that knowledge absolutely helps me as a professor and helps me as a therapist. The other direction is that as a therapist, it puts me in direct contact, where the rubber meets the road, with the action of change in individuals and the struggles and the issues that people face. And so when I am talking about things in my podcast or my reaction videos, I have that fresh in mind to draw from.
I mean, there's a lot going on with that sort of triangle that you described before: the professorship, the practice, and then the broadcasting. How do you make it work for you on a day-to-day basis in terms of dividing your time and your family as well? And how do you sort of maintain your own well-being and sanity, given you've got so many things happening on the go?
Well, it's a good question. in my 14 years of podcasting, have always been a therapist and a professor. So I've always had to balance it in various different ways. And of course, a primary consideration is, am I able to pay my bills? Currently the configuration is I'm actually not teaching right now. I scaled way back at the university and am very much part-time. And I decided to take this term off because I just wanted to, I guess. And plan on teaching later, but probably, just one class every now and then. So that's put aside. And then my practice is very small. I haven't accepted a new client in years. The majority of what I do in terms of work is broadcasting, as you're putting it. And I like that broad because it encompasses the whole kind of shit, right?
Video, podcast, everything.
Yeah. And so if you watched my life, my waking life, you wouldn't know I was a professor or a therapist. You just say, oh, he's just a broadcaster at this point, which is quite true. And so in terms of keeping my sanity, I'm pretty good at drawing boundaries with things that I don't want to do. But currently I'll level with you, Mike, and tell you that I feel like I'm running a little thin with my soul with the broadcasting element because, the podcast takes up a lot of time and the YouTube channel takes up a lot of time, and you put both together and I'm pretty much working a lot, let's just say. And so I feel like it's not really sustainable. So something's got to give at some point, but it's like trying to choose between two of your children, just like, which one do I neglect? I don't know. I don't want to do that. It's too dear to me and it's fun. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do.
I think that's interesting, Kirk. I have a bit of a theory for me that certainly held true that you can only ever do probably 3 or 4 things well at a time. And it's sort of a juggle. And if you try and exceed that sort of magic number of 3 or 4 things, you're going to be terrible at everything. And it'll take you a while to realize that. So I'm sort of pretty careful now to just try and concentrate on what are the few things that I do. But what you didn't answer in your question that I am pretty curious about, because you've got with the therapy and the practice and the broadcasting as well, how do you replenish and regain energy and sort of vitality? Because I know that being a therapist can be pretty heavy. You're hearing a lot of difficult things and a lot of things come up. Are you an exerciser, meditator? Well, what is it for you that works?
Another good question that I probably don't have the healthiest of answer to, honestly. I know that maybe better therapists than me would have this really elaborate sort of system of meditation and, baths and, hiking or whatnot. But, me and my wife were this phase, the quarantine really turned us into homebodies. We really, it's just we're home a lot with our dogs. And so, I'll exercise a little bit, but honestly, I've reached a point in my career with, my various different activities that it doesn't really drain me. I don't feel depleted after work. And I think particularly the podcast, sometimes I'll be a little mentally tired, like, I just yammered for like 7 hours. Like my brain is just not working, but I'm not wiped out. I'm not unmotivated. I'm not like, I remember, getting back to Foot Locker, Mike, when I would get off work, because you're on your feet all day and I'm dealing with an a-hole boss and there's all these customers and I'm scrambling to sell because I'm completely on commission, and I would take the bus downtown and the bus home. And by the time I got home, I just wanted to go to sleep. And I remember thinking, this job must suck. So my days are not like the Foot Locker job. So I guess the answer is I don't need to have a regimen.
Yeah, you feel pretty replenished.
I probably should for my cortisol level and whatnot.
But look, I think I've just realized that we might about hit the time limit on our little Zoom session. I can't speak highly enough of how interesting Kirk's videos are, even if you don't like reality TV, even if you just want to understand the psychology of Elizabeth Holmes or some of these other really interesting characters out there. I mean, you do a fantastic job. It's so engaging, it's so insightful, and it's just so different. I mean, what I like as a creator is I feel like you've brought something into the world that no one knew they wanted, and then you made it, and then everyone was like, yes, this is exactly what I need right now. So congratulations to you.
Thanks. That's nice. Good.